Hello, viewers and listeners. This is your co-host Stu, and I'm here with the paranormalist, Patty Wilson. Patty, hi.
Hi, how are you doing tonight?
I'm real good, thanks.
Awesome, glad to hear it. So you ready for tonight's adventure? Because I have a great set of stories to tell.
I'm all ears.
Oh, good. Well, I brought with me a friend who's going to help me. We're going to talk about skeletons, your skeleton fella, and screaming skulls.
Interesting. Okay.
So inside the genre of ghosts and hauntings, there are these little specialty things that come up from time to time. And one I have been following for many, many years are the concept of skeletal ghosts and screaming skulls. They are apparently related in some ways. But can you imagine a haunting where it's not just a regular ghost that appears as a person, but it actually just appears as a skeleton? And how terrifying that would be.
I can't imagine. And have you experienced that yourself in any of your investigations?
I have not, but there is a plethora of stories, historically speaking. And I went on, so I've collected some stories in person, and I went on some sites, and then it was interesting. Somebody ran a story on one of their sites, and then there was like a feed underneath it of responses, and it was amazing. Over and over, people getting on and saying, oh my God, I thought I was the only one who ever saw something crazy like that, and then telling their stories. And I found that in multiple places throughout the internet, and I thought, well, isn't that interesting? It's such an isolating event, because all these people have held on to these stories for so many years. And along with the screaming skull stories are these skeleton stories. So we're going to delve into some of these bone-chilling, pardon the pun, tales. So
you couldn't resist, could you?
I couldn't. I'm sorry. I'm a punny person. I really am.
Oh, I can't handle the punishment.
So let's get started. So the first story that I chose for tonight is out around at Desert State Park in San Diego, California. There's a long-held story. This is between the Superstition Mountains and 17 Palms in this area. There's a legend that has been in existence for well over 100 years. And the story, it goes like this. So there was a prospector who was up in the Superstition Mountains, and those who are treasure hunting inclined knows that those mountains are supposedly home to a vast treasure that was lost and has never yet been recovered. And this prospector was up there when he claimed that he noted his burrow began to act up. It was, wouldn't go forward. It was kind of making noises, spooking and what have you. And so he stopped and he was looking around, and that's when he saw it coming toward him. He described an extremely tall skeleton with a lantern inside the chest cavity and glowing, lit and glowing. And it was shambling past him across the desert. And he said he got the distinct impression it was lost, like the spirit of a lost man. But the spirit was a little larger than human. Over the course of the years, this story has gotten some traction. It'll all but die out, and then somebody will have another experience, and the old stories will come back out again. So various prospectors have seen this spirit, most often near a place called Barago Springs. I hope I'm pronouncing that one right. And it's the same story, horrifying man, skeleton of a person. They take it to be male, and he's a little larger than a human person with this huge lantern inside his chest that's lit. And he always seems to be, stumbling along as though he's lost. One man actually got so frightened he shot at it, but he said the thing it didn't respond in any way. It just kept on moving past him off into the desert, and then it was gone. I just thought it was fascinating, that legend. There's a few other legends we'll talk about.
Yeah, I'm fascinated. Why, if something is not an imminent danger, why are you taking a shot at it?
Well, I think sometimes it's maybe they feel like they're in danger.
Oh.
Like, what is this thing? How do I stop it? Is it going to come past me or come at me? So I think that might be, that might have been an inclination at that point in time.
I think if I would see an ambulatory skeleton, there's probably not a whole heck of a lot I could do to stop that from doing whatever it's going to do. So I think my curiosity would probably win out. I'd like to say that now, but I'm talking in the bravado of sitting here in my chair.
Yes. And that's the truth of it. I can't honestly tell you that if I were confronted by a skeleton that was, a phantasm of some sort moving along and having animation and being able to do things, that I would find it something I could easily sit and watch. I might be just as frightened and run just as fast and get as far from it as most people in the stories have. So, but I think it's fascinating. Now, I have to tell you, one of the things one of the trends in the skeleton part of the genre is that a lot of these skeleton stories happen to children. There's a couple things that are present in not all, but a large percentage of the stories. The children are young, between 4 and 9 years old. Now, a 4-year-old, you might argue they don't remember things very well, although I have a 4-year-old grandson who can tell you things that are amazing that he remembers. Don't make a promise to him you don't plan to keep, because he will dig it up word for word 6 months from now and remind you. But at the age of 9, that's a pretty good, age for being able to remember things that happened and to be able to discern the difference between illusion and sleep and what have you. And one of the things that's fascinating in these stories is that it's usually in the middle of the night, approximately 3 a.m., that they wake up. Some of them don't identify it as 3 a.m., but they'll say just like in the middle of the night. Others will say, I know it was 3 a.m. because, they heard something that happens at that time of night, or they looked at their clock in their bedroom, or whatever it was, if they were little older kids. But so let's just get to the first story and you'll see what I'm saying. Now, this is a story of a boy who said this happened when he was 7. So he said he woke up one night, he was sitting in bed, and his bedroom was across from his baby sister's room. She was about 18 months old and still sleeping in a crib. And it was his habit when he woke up, he would kind of look through his doorway to her room to see if everything was okay in her room, just because he was the big brother,
Sure.
And at that point, he saw something moving in the darkness underneath the crib, that shadowy place. There was a night light in the little girl's room. And he's watching it thinking, what is that? Now, they don't have any pets or anything like that in the house. So he's watching it kind of confused. And then it comes out from under the crib, and it's a skeleton. And he said he just froze, sitting there in the bed, watching it as it crawled out from under the bed, stood up by the crib, looked at his sister, and then turned its head and looked directly at him. And he knew it had seen him. And he talked about it being moments until it broke its gaze away. But, it probably was more likely seconds. It's just that things feel like it takes forever when you're scared to death. Sure. And it crossed the bedroom towards her closet and walked through the closet door. It was closed and it just went right through the door. And he sat there for a long, long time, afraid to move, afraid to, not knowing what to do with all of this. And he said he was very much aware that he was awake. He knew he was awake. And eventually his exhaustion overtook him and he fell asleep. He woke up in the morning. Everything was fine. His little sister was fine. And during the course of the day, he kind of worked up his courage and went into the bedroom and opened the closet door to see if there was something in there. And of course, there was nothing in there. He tried to tell his mom about it, but she kept saying, oh, you had a nightmare. And he said, I know it wasn't a nightmare. This thing is seared into my head. I just don't know what it was, but it looked like a skeleton. I don't know why it was in my sister's room.
And to come from under the bed.
Yeah, it came from under her crib, yeah.
No wonder kids think that there's a monster under their beds. Because sometimes there are.
I think that sometimes we forget that. I have a collection of stories that I tell sometimes when I speak. And there's stories about children who are not believed, and then something happens that proves that what they said is true. Disappearances, things like that. Like they're saying, like, there's something coming to get me. I know it is. I know there's something out there. I don't want to go. And the parents are like, go, just go do whatever they tell them are told to do. And then they don't come back. Things like that. But I think that also there are things sometimes under the bed. There are things sometimes in the closet. Are they interdimensional? What are they? That's the big question. But, you know, what are they? I don't know. So the next story is a bit of a piece of folklore. So the story takes place in New Mexico. It's a very popular legend in New Mexico. And the version I'm telling is retold by a friend of mine, S.E. Slosher. I know, I've known her for many years. And she does like historical research on legends and folklore and what have you, and then puts them into books, short story collections. So this is her research, and I wanted to give her credit for it. So this is the story of a young man who was out looking for work at about the turn of the 20th century, late 1800s, early 20th century. And he had heard there was some work a couple towns over, so he had started heading out, you know, to that town to look for work. He had put in applications all along the way. He was desperate for work. And he gets almost to the town before darkness falls, and he realizes he's not going to be able to talk to these people until the next day. He's certainly not going to turn around and go back. He's been on foot all day walking. He sees this old house, little cabin or cottage up the road a little ways. It looks abandoned, and he thinks, okay, I'll just take shelter there for the night. And in the morning, I'll wash up and keep on going, get to that town, which is only going to be a couple of miles further down the road, and see if I can't get a job. You know, some people might wonder why he didn't just keep walking. Well, he had no money to stay anywhere, so this was probably a better choice than trying to find somebody willing to let him sleep in a barn. Not always an easy task, you know. So anyhow, he gets into the little rundown house, and there's a few pieces of odd furniture still left there, a chair on the floor. He finds a nub of a candle, a little piece of a candle, and he lights it, and he settles down after he looks around a little bit to make sure there's nobody else in his environment. And he's trying to go to sleep. It's cold and damp and miserable, and you know, he really just wants this to be over with, morning to come and him to get to that town. As he's kind of snuggled up against the one back wall where he can watch the entrance to the house in the main room, he hears this voice screaming out, "I'm falling down!" And he jumps, and he's like, holy crap, there's somebody out there. And he hears it a couple more times, and then through the broken window comes what he described as a skeletal arm thrown through the window. And it yells again, and another arm, skeletal bone of an arm, goes through. And this continues until the arms are through, the head is through, the torso is through, and the legs are through. And he's just sitting there, you know, terrified, trying to figure out what's going on, who's throwing these bones at him. And at that point, as soon as the last piece gets thrown through the window, the entire thing assembles itself into a being, just a complete skeleton now. And the boy is petrified, but he's afraid to show how frightened he is. So the skeleton looks at him, and he said, you just got the impression it was grinning madly. It was pleased with itself for scaring him so. And he held his head up, and he pretended he wasn't afraid, because he needed to get between him and that door was the skeleton. He needed to get around somehow to that door to get out of there. And the skeleton saw that he wasn't afraid, or at least he wasn't showing his fear. And he heard it say, "You have courage, son. You're brave enough. Do you want to wrestle me?" And the boy certainly didn't want to, but he didn't want to refuse because he was afraid it would attack him. So he just stood there, and the thing started like sizing him up, almost like a sumo wrestler coming at him, and he would scuffle off to one side and then scuffle off to the other, and it lunged at him and caught hold of him. and they wrestled back and forth now in desperation because he's terrified and he wants let free of that thing so he can get to that door. Suddenly he as this thing's pulling him down, he remembers a trick his older brother taught him when they were wrestling, and he twists and he does what his brother showed him to do, and the skeleton goes flying and crashes to the ground, much like a man would have. At that point, the skeleton sits up and says, "You've won." Such a courage for a young man. "I'll tell you what, come and I will give you my treasure." So the boy is startled, but he kind of pauses and he's like, what kind of treasure? What are you talking about? And the skeleton says, "Pick me up and carry me on your back to the next room, and I will give you my treasure, and make sure you take your candle." So the boy scrambles over and he lights the candle, and he starts to the room, and the thing jumps and attaches itself to its back, and he starts into the room, and it blows the candle out somehow. The candle just dies, and he stops and he lights the candle again, and the skeleton does it again, and he says, "Stop that. I won't go into the room until you stop that." And the skeleton says, "Oh, you are brave." And he says, "If you don't stop it, I'll drop you and I'll smash your bones. I mean it, I'm done." And the skeleton laughs again, and he said, "You're strong and you're courageous. Step through the doorway and you will see." So he does step through the doorway with the skeleton right behind him. And he had been in the room when he first came in. Remember, I said he kind of looked around.
Right.
And it was a regular, what looked like maybe a bedroom. Now it's filled with bags of gold and jewels and what have you. And he said, it wasn't in here whenever I came earlier. And he said, "Only those I want to see it are allowed to see." And he said, "Because of your courage, because you took me on, I will give this to you, but you must promise me one thing first." And the boy said, "What?" He said, "Tomorrow morning you will find as many poor people as you can throughout the day, and each of them you will give a bag of my treasure to, silver, gold, jewels, whatever. At the end of the day, what still remains is yours, and I will trouble you no more." And the boy did exactly that. And he would end up with a vast array of treasure, which he and his family would use to live on for the rest of their lives, had he not shown that courage. Now, it sounds like a legend and a folklore, and very well could be, but you should know that in Pennsylvania German literature, the concept of being approached by a spirit or a skull or an entity, often on fire, was because the spirit was drawing your attention to the fact there was a treasure buried at that spot, and it wanted to give this treasure to you either to make peace with God or because you were particularly deserving in some way. It found you deserving. So there are stories and legends like that exist, and I just thought it was really interesting because I know those legends,
Yeah.
Now, New Mexico would be a long way, but stories pass on, and maybe every culture looks at stories differently. So maybe the Pennsylvania German culture defined them one way, and you'll find that maybe another culture defined them slightly different, but still had similar experiences. And we're going to talk a little bit about that further on when we get to the Screaming Skulls part of this particular episode. So the next one I'd like to share is about a boy who wrote in and shared his story. This happened when he was 6. He said he woke up in the middle of the night and he rolled over and looked out his window. He had a bedroom on the first floor. It was a ranch style, and his window looked out on the driveway. So his mother and dad's cars were out in the driveway. He would normally just see them there every night when he'd roll over and look out the window. And on this night, he rolls over and he looks out the window, and he sees a skeleton sitting atop his mother's car that was parked under the trees and looking up at the sky or at the tree. He said he didn't know what, and it was swaying back and forth slightly. And he said as he was watching it, trying to make sense out of it, trying to run like, what else could that be? Is it lights and shadows? What is it? He said the thing stood up and it just hopped to the ground, and the next thing he knew, within seconds, it was at the foot of his bed. How it got there, he has no clue. He saw it hit the ground, and then poof, it was at the foot of his bed. And he said he felt fear because it was suddenly in the house. He had been okay watching it outside because outside it seemed like it was safe for him inside. But now it's in the house, it's at his bed. And for a few minutes it stood there, and he finally didn't know what to do, so he rolled over and he pulled the blankets up over himself as it was standing there watching him, thinking, I don't know what else to do. So he hid, and when he peeked out, it was still there, but now it was laying on the floor beside the bed, propped up on its elbow, watching him like it was curious about what he was doing and waiting him out. And he said, that's the last I remember of it. Whenever I was done, I remember nothing more until morning, and I woke up and I was really, scared, and it was gone. It was very frightening to be up close with that thing, to watch it, to watching me. And he said, I tried to tell somebody about it, but nobody would believe me, because who believes that a little boy saw a skeleton at night? Everyone told him, as most people do, it was just a bad dream. But he said, I know it wasn't a bad dream because I was awake, because I remember it completely, because I could remember the wind coming in through the window. I remember those things. And, those are things that you don't really usually remember, the wind blowing across your face, or things like that in a dream. That's the kind of stuff that I have to tell you, I think tends to make me believe that it might be more real than not. I actually had a waking nightmare one time, and saw something I know was not there. Okay. But I know I was awake. It was raining. I could feel the mist from the rain blowing in my window on my face. And I knew it wasn't there, but I still saw it. I can't explain that. So sometimes I tend to give them a little bit of the benefit of the doubt, because I've had those moments myself. I can't, to this day, and that happened when I was 18 years old. The last night we lived in a little house, and I know that it had no history to back up what I saw, but I still saw it clearly, and I know it wasn't there. I won't tell you I saw it and it was there. I saw it and I knew I was hallucinating, but I couldn't stop.
Interesting. I had a similar experience where I woke up. Well, I thought I woke up, and standing next to my bed is a 6-foot tall cloaked figure, like the Grim Reaper. The only thing missing in it was the sigh in his hand. And I just looked like, this is certainly weird. I screamed out, startled, and then said, I'm sleepy and I want to go to bed. I lay back down.
And things like that happen to people. Like mine was when I was, like I said, 18, and it was the last night in this little, like a bungalow that my mother had rented. It was a 2-bedroom bungalow, just an average little house, and it had no great history to it. There was no great history to the ground that I'm aware of. And it was raining this last night, and we had like 5 or 6 garbage bags on the back edge of the back porch that we were going to take down to the garbage man in the morning. And then we were done. This was our last night in this house. The people were coming to help us move. Everything's packed in boxes. And in the middle of the night, I woke up, and I was hearing that drip, 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 drip sound of water hitting the garbage bags. And we didn't have a leak on the porch on the rain spouting that would have made that sound, at least not up until that night. And so I got up and I sat up and I looked out the window, and I can remember the coldness of the rain, the windy coming in, and it was all full of mist and rain. It was on my face. And as I'm looking at the edge of the porch, it had stopped raining. It was just that misty stuff now. And there was this man hanging upside down by his feet, and it was his fingertips hitting the garbage bags that was making that drip, drip sound. And I remember I'm standing there, and I remember to pinch myself. Bizarrely, I'd read this ghost story like months earlier, that if you pinched yourself and you felt the pain, you weren't asleep. And I actually did. I'm sitting there staring at it easily 2 minutes. And I'm not exaggerating on this, because I remember counting time, thinking, okay, if it's a hallucination, it'll go away in a second. And then I pinched myself, and it didn't go away. And I thought, well, I remember in another story that said, look away and look back, it'll be gone if it's not real. So I looked away and I looked back, it was still there. I looked away and I looked back and it was still there. And I'm now kind of getting to the point of panic because it's still there. This dead guy hanging upside down. And I look the third time and I look back and it's gone. So it was easily 2 minutes till I started trying to find a way to explain this hallucination. I can't tell you what it was to this day. But I know I was awake. That I can tell you for a fact. I've had bad dreams and I knew I was sleeping. I woke up from them, but this was completely different. I've never experienced it before or since.
And probably don't want to.
No, I don't. But when I hear these stories, these people, these are adults describing something that happened when they were children. They use a lot of the same terminology and, what have you. So I wonder, what mechanism is at play with them. I don't doubt that they saw something. I don't know what it was. So I want to make that clear. But it had presented itself to them in this fashion. And then the next question is why? So as we're going through the stories, that might be something we're going to talk a little bit about towards the end of the whole process. So the next one is again a child, an adult man talking about when he was 6 years old. School had let out for the summer and he was excited because, he didn't have to go to bed anytime or, at a certain time. And he was a night owl anyway. So after his parents went to sleep, he went out and he sat down in the living room. They had this French doors that were locked, but they were glass and he could see the moon really well. And so he was sitting out there watching the moon and playing with some toys quietly in front of that where it was bright because the moon was bright and he didn't have to have a light on. And that's when he saw something walking from the left side of his porch up towards the driveway, just the motion of it. And at first he thought that somebody was out on the porch, maybe one of his cousins or, his aunt who would show up late at night for no good reason. And, it just was that lady. And he was watching it thinking he was fully expecting a person, somebody he knew, but it wasn't. And whenever it got to the steps for the porch, it came up the steps and he could hear it stepping. And then it stepped into the light from the moon and it was a skeleton. And he said the first thought wasn't, ghost or anything. It was there's some crazy person outside our house in his Halloween costume. But it slowly moved, and as it turned to face him, he knew it wasn't a guy in a costume. You could see through it. And he said the bones glowed almost a blue fluorescence, but very pale. But it was like self-illuminating. So he's watching it, and it raised its hand, and it motioned for him to come out. And he was not going out. But he said, and it didn't use verbal words, but in his head, he heard it talking. And he said it was telling him to come out, that it had something to show him. And he was not interested at all. So he made sure he pulled on the door, made sure the door was locked, and then took off to his bedroom, turned on his light in his bedroom, and sat on his bunk on the bunk beds. His brother, who also shared the room, wasn't there that night. And that's when he heard the tapping on the window. And he looked up, and it was standing there outside his bedroom window, motioning to him again to come out. And again, he heard the voice in his head say, "Come out, I have things to show you. You're one of us now." That's a very frightening thing to say to a child. You're one of us now.
Yeah, that's define us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So he kind of bunches himself up in the bunk and he won't go near the window and he kind of pulls the blankets up. The lights are on, and he had thought at one point that if he could turn the lights on, that this thing would just go away, like how shadows disappear in the light. And this didn't happen that way. So he waited and eventually he fell asleep. And he said, for him, though, this was not a singular event. It would continue. His parents, his siblings, they would all hear this tapping on the window. They cut the tree branches back. They cut bushes off. but they would always hear this, not every night, but every so often you'd have a night of the tapping on the window. He didn't see it again until he was about 17. And he said, I knew it was out there every time it would tap. It was the same sound, and I knew it was waiting for me. But when he was about 17, it showed up again, and that was outside his window, and it told him that you need to come out and see us. We have magic to teach you. And he said this time it had a skeleton had a cloak, and it said, it wants to meet me and teach me his magic of all things. And he said, I know it wasn't a dream, and it scared me to death, and it told me to come out that night. So he gathered up his friends, and they sat in the car in the driveway, and they waited. And he thought, it won't come now that all these kids are around, right? I'm safe. I'm in a group. He said, but we had the headlights on, and we were aiming it towards the woods where it had come from the first time. And it started out of the woods. He said we could see just something moving and shifting, walking, that, that swaying gait of a person walking. And it got closer until it stepped into the headlights. And it was about 50 feet from the car at that point. And he said, whenever all of a sudden, it was visible for everybody. And he said to one of the kids, please tell me you see that too. And the boy said, hell yes. And at that moment, he turned the car on. The other kids were slamming down the locks on the doors because they were scared to death. They were also seeing it. And they took off out of the driveway. And he said he got away. He described it as translucent and glowing. So we got away, we got down the road, and I felt this immense pull, this sense that I needed to go back and learn whatever it was that it was trying to tell me. And he said it was confusing because every instinct in his body was run. And yet there was something deep inside of him telling him go back. And eventually he convinced his friends that he had to go back. And he said, I knew there were others in the woods waiting, others like it in the woods waiting. But when he went back, there was nothing there. And he said, I think that it was because I changed the dynamic by bringing my friends. So I was no longer wanted by it.
And we don't know what the motive was.
No, what does it mean you're one of us? What does it mean I have to teach you the magic of all things?
If somebody told you that, I mean, that's tempting.
It is tempting.
But is that exactly what we don't need?
I'm pretty sure that's what we don't need, yeah. But it's a fascinating story, isn't it?
Quite, and then some. Yeah.
So my next one actually I interviewed the person myself that this story happened with. So this young man was about 19 years old. His family lived in this old house in central Pennsylvania. Had lived in a house since he was about 12. And his bedroom was at the far back end of the house. There's a back door that stepped out onto a porch right beside his bedroom door. So he's in his bedroom. He's the only person in the house. His family's all gone for the evening. And he's on the phone talking to his girlfriend. It was his first serious relationship. And you know how they talk for hours and hours? Well, that's what he's doing. And all of a sudden, he hears the back door beside his door open. And it slams shut. Well, he thinks immediately somebody's broken into the house because his mom and them don't use that door ever. They all park out front. He is the only person who really goes up and down that porch because there was one single parking spot back there. And since he worked in the evenings and at night, since he had graduated high school, he just came and went that way and then didn't disturb everybody else throughout the house. And he had that parking spot out back and everybody else parked out front. So he hears the footsteps after the door slams shut, and he tells his girlfriend, hey, wait, there's somebody in the house. I got to go find out what's going on. And he knew he had not locked the door, so it was possible somebody broke into the house. Okay, he knew that. So he grabs a baseball bat in the corner and he starts out the long hallway, gets out the hallway, and there, as he turns at the edge of the hallway, he turns towards the dining room den area. there stood, and he described it this way. It was a head about twice as large as a human head, but it was a skeletal head, just a skeleton of it. And it was on fire, like flames around it, all around it. And it was leering at him. Now, in the dining room area, there was a fireplace and it was lit. And it was a regular old-fashioned one with real wood. It had been on all evening. He would go out every so often and put wood in it and then go back because he was supposed to keep it up till his family got back home. And he's standing there staring at it, and he said it began to bounce. And it was bouncing back and forth, getting ever closer to the fireplace. And it bounced until it hit the fireplace, and a log rolled out of the fireplace on fire and rolled into the middle of the room and started the carpet on fire. And he's like, I grabbed at it with the tongs, threw it back into the fire, patted it out, and there was a burn spot on the carpeting where it had hit and laid for a few seconds. And I looked up, it was gone. And he said, I got a distinct impression that whatever it was, it had meant to set the house on fire that night. Interestingly enough, that house would catch fire in that room several years later and burn down.
Hopefully with nobody home.
Everybody got out, okay. And it was interesting because they don't know why the fire started in that room. There was no fire in the fireplace that day, nothing like that.
First time I have ever heard of a flaming skull like that outside of a video game.
Yeah, I know. But and it was, like you said, about twice as large as a human skull. And it was bouncing and dancing and bouncing and dancing back and forth, getting closer and closer. And he's standing there. He didn't know what to do because what do you do? I mean, are you going to hit it with a baseball bat? Is that going to make it mad? And he said, I just know that there were so many crazy things in that house that it just was terrifying. His grandmother didn't want to stay in the house when she'd come to visit. She would make everybody go outside and sit because she didn't like it in the house. Different people had different reactions. And he said nobody else told him that story ever, but there were multitudes of ghost stories about this house. So
yeah, that's thinking, sorry, just
yeah, that's right. So if ghosts can choose their form, and
mm-hmm.
I think they can.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm thinking like fire elemental.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But but if ghosts can choose their form, because a lot of times you have a person that dies when they're old and they return healthy and young looking. When you see them again. And then other ones, they appear just the way they were when they last were seen by their loved ones. But they seem to be able to choose in some respect how they are formed. I think it may be the longer they're at it, the better they get at it. At the beginning, you'll see ghosts with parts of them missing and like their feet aren't materialized or stuff like that. There's a lot of ghost stories about stuff like that.
Rookie ghost mistake, right?
Yeah, it's a rookie ghost mistake. I love that. I never thought of it that way, but yeah. So, but I just thought that was a fascinating story. And this story's less than 15 years old.
Wow. Okay.
So it's a very recent story. In fact, I was talking to the young man and I was prepping this episode and he asked me what I was going to do a podcast on, and I told him, and he's like, oh my God, tell me a couple of the stories. So I told him a couple of the stories. And that's when he said, I've never told anybody, but this is what happened to me when I was 19. And then he just told the story.
That is just so bizarre.
Yes.
But it's, what's the phrase? So bizarre, it has to be true.
It's insane. So the next one I'd like to share with you is about a ghostly camel and his skeletal passenger. So during the 1800s, when the cavalry was trying to conquer the American Southwest, horses struggled with the desert. They needed too much water. They had a hard time walking for any great length of time. Camels are perfect. That's all they're built for. So they actually brought in several hundred camels for the cavalry to use. And it was a program that lasted for a few years, only 3 or 4 years. But camels are nothing like horses. They're stubborn, they're independent, they're big compared to to most riding horses, and they're difficult to control. And these cowboys just had no clue what to do with them. So they had built these seats that they have in the desert that you sit in, on the hump or between the humps or however it is. And these cavalrymen would have to ride these camels. There is a story about a camel that was being mistreated by a young man who was one of the soldiers. He was annoyed to pieces because the doggone thing would not do what he wanted it to do ever. And it took off into the desert and just kept going and wouldn't stop. And he couldn't get off of it. When he tried to get off of it, his foot caught in the straps and it ended up dragging him to death.
Oh.
There have been, and whenever this camel was seen, it was seen for several years. The leg bone of this soldier was still attached to the strapping, and they would see it going. Nobody could catch it. Nobody could stop it. And it went on like that for quite a while. And then finally we're assuming it died. It just died out in the desert. After that, there have been many encounters where people have seen this camel wandering through the desert with the dead cavalryman still clutched in the seat, and he appears as a skeleton.
With both legs?
Yes, before he fell.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, there's some bizarre stuff out there, because I've seen a little bit of it, but man, there's some bizarre stuff out there.
Well, and the story about the camel and all of that, I mean, they even know the name of the soldier. And there is that part of the whole story is all true and verifiable. And he was definitely seen, this camel was definitely seen with the skeletal remains dragging along for a while, and then it started to fall apart. As the skeleton fell apart, it got to the point where all that was left was the leg bone hanging high enough up it didn't get caught on the ground anywhere, and it just dangled as it wandered around the desert.
I'm just sitting here dumbfounded.
I know, it's cool, but it's a cool story. It really is in its own way. So back to PA. So there was a gentleman by the name of Mark McCoy. He was a highwayman at the turn of the into the 1800s. Okay, and he was one of those guys that would like come popping out at you, and as you're riding along one of the isolated roads in Pennsylvania and in the woods, and he would rob you. That's what he did. He lived in a boarding house that was run by a young lady who was a widow, and he fell in love with her. And he did this thing where he was like, boy, I don't want her to find out I'm a bad guy, so I'm going to just like rob one really good rich dude and then take that money, and I'll propose to her and we'll go somewhere else and settle down and nobody will know. Only thing is, she didn't want to marry him. And he robbed this person and came back to the boarding house, and he told her how much he loved her and how he wanted to start a whole new life, and she tried to let him down easy, and he got pissy and he took off, and now he's got his wind in his sails, and he had made a mistake when he let the guy live, this last guy that he robbed, because the guy knew who he was. He recognized him. And it didn't take long for a posse to catch this guy, and he decided to fight it out rather than let them hang him. So he gets killed. He was kind of the scourge of the area at the time, so nobody really had much mercy for his body. They dug a shallow grave and dumped it along the side of the road and covered him over, and that was that. Well, over the course of time, sometimes the bones would work their way up out of the ground, and you'd see a arm bone or a foot bone or something, a rib, part of the rib bones, and somebody would come along, have a bit of pity, and throw some dirt over top of them and let it go at that. Eventually somebody built a cabin not too far from this impromptu gravesite and settled in there. He invited some friends to go hunting with him. This would have been like the late 1800s by now. Almost 80 years have gone by. And he got himself a couple really good hunting dogs. And he was going to train them and get them ready. And he was really excited because he thought, his dogs were doing really well. And he couldn't wait to show them off to his buddies. And he had 3 or 4 buddies coming the next day so he turned the dogs loose. They were just howling and carrying on. And he's like, well, let them tree a coon or something. They'll burn out of their system tonight, and tomorrow night they'll be raring to go again. So he turns them loose, and they come back, and they're barking and snarling and carrying on, and he goes out on the porch to look to see what they're having, fully expecting them to be fighting over a dead coon or a possum or something. They've got the skull of a man, and they're snarling and carrying on about it. And he picks it up, and he breaks, gets it away from the dogs, and he picks it up, and he's like, what the hell? And he doesn't know what to do with it. It's like, where did it come from? What's going on? And now he's a little spooked out. So he sits it up high where the dogs can't get it, thinking he's going to call the police and, go to the police in the morning and talk to them and tell them that he has no clue where the skulls come from, but there's a skull. And obviously there's somebody dead out there in the woods, and they need to figure this out. He doesn't know anything about Mark McCoy or what had happened all those years earlier. It's mystery to him. And that night, while he tries to settle down, he's laying in bed, and all of a sudden he hears this screaming and caterwauling outside. He's like, what the heck is that? And he runs to the door with a gun in his hand, and there's the skull bouncing across the ground, screaming, and the sound was coming out of it, loud, howling wails. And he was like, holy crap. And he tried to shoot at it, and it didn't do it any good, and he didn't damage it at all, and it just kept screaming. And the dogs were back in the house, and they were like cowering in the corner, whimpering. And finally he just shut the door and waited it out all night long. There wasn't much else he could do. Come morning, the skull was laying on the porch again. He picked it up, and his buddies came, and he told them the crazy story about the night before, and they're like, yeah, that's bullshit. So they go into town, and they take the skull with them, and they show it to the sheriff in town, and he's like, well, there's an old story. There's an old body buried out there, and he tells them the story of Mark McCoy. He's like, I wonder if them dogs didn't dig up that grave. So they go out there, and amongst them all, they manage to locate the grave, and sure enough, it was dug up, and there's some bones scattered around, and McCoy's head is missing. So they tuck the head back in with the rest of the bones and give it a cursory little throw of dirt, and that's that until that night. All those men are sitting in the house talking and getting ready for hunting the next day, and they start to hear the screaming and the wailing and the howling, just like it had been the night before. And they're all petrified now. And they look out the window, and sure enough, there's that skull bouncing back and forth, gibbering and carrying on insanely. And the dogs had been inside, so the dogs didn't just dig it back up. It come up out of that ground by itself. And they're petrified. So long about daylight, it stops. And they hightail it in town, get to the sheriff, tell him everything that's going on. And the sheriff's like, well, this don't sound like some law work. This sounds like it needs a minister. So they go and talk to a pastor in town, and pastor says, I'll come out with the sheriff and we'll see what we can do. And they go out, and they find the body, the bones, or some of the bones are sticking up out of the ground again, and what have you, and decide to take all the bones out, dig it deep, bury it, and the pastor consecrates the ground, and then put the head and everything back in the way it was meant to be, say their prayers over it. And Mark McCoy never came out of the ground again. His skull stayed put, and so did the rest of him.
It just amazes me. I'm not saying that. I don't want to make it sound like disbelief, but it does seem incredulous that an inanimate object could make sound.
It does, but yet there are dozens of stories. There's a couple stories from England. In England, Ireland, and Scotland, sort of same general heritage. Don't want to get in trouble with anybody. I said general. Because there's also unique components to each group of people's heritage. There are stories as well of screaming skulls. You'll find them going back into the 1700s and 1600s. One of the stories was of a man who bought all the land around this one area. He was a very rich gentleman, and he decided he wanted this great big, basically plantation. And there was this old couple who had a little cottage and a few acres right smack dab in the middle of his land, what he wanted to own. And he went over and he talked to them, and he talked to them, and he talked to them, and he would talk to them about, you know, can you sell it? And he offered them good money. He wasn't being cheap, and they said, no, this is where we want to live. We've lived here forever. We want to die here. And this annoyed him to no end because they were just poor dirt farmers. And, you know, he was this really rich dude. So he just thought he had a right to this land. So what he ended up doing was paying one of his employees to steal one of the gold cups that were in his china cabinet, taking it over and hiding it at this little farm so he could go to the police and tell the local constabulary that he thinks they stole it. And of course, when it's found on their person, it's found in their house, they get arrested because there was bad blood between them, you know? So they get arrested. He testifies that they had been at the house and he had been talking to them about selling the land yet again. And he couldn't believe that before they left, they had filched this cup. And on his sole testimony, they're executed. And before they're executed, they're asked if they have anything to say. And the wife says to him, you'll not have a night's sleep of peace ever again. And your progeny from here on out, generation after generation, will grow poorer because of your greed and your lies. And we will haunt you forever. And, you know, he wasn't taking it a bit too seriously. He just really wasn't. So he laughed at them, and they hung the poor old couple that didn't do anything wrong. And they were not allowed to be buried in a proper grave because they were criminals. So they were buried outside the churchyard, another insult that they certainly did not deserve. It was that night, that very night, that the two skulls appeared for the first time in the great front hall of the mansion house he had built, screaming and carrying on, wailing and gnashing, carrying on all night long, not allowing a single party in that house to have any rest. Night after night, they would appear, physically appear. They would be gathered up and taken back to the grave and buried again, only to reappear time and time again, over and over. And as this occurred year after year, people didn't want to work for him anymore. His fortunes seemed to change. Things dried up money-wise, and generation by generation, his family grew poorer and poorer until they were peasants themselves. And all the way through this, the screaming skulls would appear from time to time and yell and carp and howl, wailing in the middle of the night until they had reached the point where they had no wealth left, and then the skulls rested.
Karma.
Karma.
But, you know, that makes me think, though. I mean, so that sounds real Old Testament, you know, when you know, the children of this man probably didn't do anything wrong, but yet they got punished, and their children got punished, and their children got punished.
Yep.
And that's yeah. How Old Testament are you going to get?
Yep. To be honest with you, that's the very first Screaming Skull story I ever heard. It was from Elliot O'Donnell's book, The Screaming Skulls, which was the title story of the book. And I was fascinated with it. Since then, I've collected a multitude of these stories, and I've got a couple more stories that I'm going to let everybody go. So there's a story about a woman by the name of Anne. She lived in Burton Agnes Hall in East Yorkshire. And the story goes that Annie was a very well-to-do woman, one of several sisters, and she was attacked one night on her way from the village to another village and was beaten and abused and left for dead. They are very circumspect about what all happened to her because I'm sure it was very bad. She survived for 3 days until she finally succumbed to her injuries and passed away. She had helped to design the home they lived in and had been completely involved in every detail of the design of this house as the oldest sister. And when she was dying, she begged them to promise her that she'd never have to leave the house, that they would bury her there at the house. And her sisters made that promise, but as soon as she died, they had her removed to be buried in the churchyard. I mean, who really wants to have their dead sister buried in their house, you know?
Property values. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So they actually talked to the priest, had her taken to the churchyard, and she was buried. But night after night, people were awakened in the house by what they called a supernatural disturbance, screaming and howling and what have you. So the girls finally went to the church vicar and told the vicar what they had done, that they had promised and had broken this promise to their then dying sister. So the vicar came up with a solution. He said, let's dig her up. Let's move her head over to the house and see if this stops the screaming and carrying on, so that at least a part of her will still be there. So they dug her up. They took her head, her skull, they put it in a little box, and they left it in the Great Hall, and she never haunted again. Anytime the skull was ever removed, for whatever the reason, like subsequent owners who didn't have any part in the story, and they didn't want to have a dead lady's head hanging in their Great Hall, you know, so they would have her like removed to the churchyard. One time a maid thought it was grisly, and so she threw it out the window and hoped that it would just just be gone. She's like, I don't want to look at this thing every day. And then second it happened, stuff started happening at the house. So they finally, one of the owners actually had a box built and had it secreted in the walls so that nobody had to look at her, and yet she would still remain in her home. And there are literally dozens and dozens of these stories in some various, mutation, all throughout England, Ireland, and Scotland, and predominantly. So I want to tell one more story, and it's a little bit different, but it's a fascinating story nonetheless. So in Pennsylvania, there is an area called the Prince Galitzin State Park. Are you familiar with the story of Prince Galitzin?
A bit, and we camp there all the time.
Okay.
It's one of our favorite places to go. Yeah.
So I'll give a very quick brief sketch of Prince Galitzin. Prince Galitzin was a Russian prince who, as a boy, his mother had him educated both in the Protestant faith and the Catholic faith. She was Catholic, his father was Protestant. His father was always away in the military and doing political campaigns and what have you. So she had that luxury. She would publicly have him educated as a Protestant and privately hired a priest to teach him and his sister Catholicism. When he was 17 years old, he told her that he wanted to become a priest. And she realized that her husband was going to find out now, and he was going to be really angry because he had an entire agenda planned for this boy. He would become a soldier, and he would become a diplomat, and he would follow his father's footsteps. And if he became a Catholic priest, his father would have to disown him. So she talked to her son, she talked to the priest, and in secret she took apart her wedding dress and built his vestments, because he had to come up to go to study to be a priest. You had to have your own vestments when you arrived. And she couldn't take the money to buy the stuff, so she tore apart her wedding dress. And interestingly enough, at the church, Prince Galitzin Church, which still exists in Loretto, there is a glass case in which hang his vestments, the very ones his mother sewed together for him from her wedding gown. And he did come to the United States. It's a fascinating story, and I'm glossing over tons of stuff. And he became a priest in Maryland, and he traveled. Literally, he got a circuit, and it was hundreds of miles long, and he would walk or ride from area to area and open up Catholic churches, and then he would visit them periodically. Well, he ended up settling up in the Galitzin area, and Loretto and Galitzin area, and he started what would be his primary church. It's not a large church. It was never a large church. It's a very small church to this day. It's still open, and there's a larger church beside it, but they still hold services there during Christmas at Prince Galitzin or Father Galitzin's church. And he started the little town there. Well, eventually the Protestants and the Catholics who lived in the town got into a huge fight about things like alcohol and how you practice your faith and what have you. And it turned violent to the point where the Protestants decided to go and burn the Catholic Church down. And Prince Gallitzin, Father Gallitzin, showed up at the church and tried to dissuade them and protect his church. And some of the Catholics from the area came to back up the priest. And one of the Protestants took a swing with a knife at the priest, and one of the Catholic men stood in between. And he had his arm severely damaged by that knife blade. In fact, it would incapacitate that arm for the rest of his life. And Father Gallitzin knew that this gentleman had protected him and saved his life, because if he hadn't intervened, that knife would have struck him in the chest. So when the gentleman died, he was buried in the churchyard there, but it was decided that years later that they would move his grave, this gentleman's grave, over to a place called Hart's Sleeping Place in Carrolltown, Cambria County. The church there is called the St. Joseph's Mission Church. It's a really old, I think it's the oldest church in the Altoona-Johnstown Diocese. And his family was being buried there. So his ancestors had decided to move all the people from all of their family from other churchyards to this one and create this huge family plot. When they did this, they unearthed him, and his arm was still whole. The rest of him had fallen into disrepair. It was a skeleton, like we would expect, but the arm that had been damaged was still healthy with pink flesh. It was called the incorruptible arm, and he was placed in the ground. It was considered a miracle. In fact, if you want to be a saint, there have to be a series of miracles that can be defined. This is one of the miracles. And the family would document this, that after 23 years in the ground, this arm had not rotted. So it's the opposite, that he was a skeleton, but the arm was not. There's actually a window in the church over there that shows the progression of the fight and the incorruptible arm. There was a priest who came from Europe to visit, and he saw him, the dead man, in the churchyard with his arm held up. And there's actually a picture, a stained glass window in the church that has the incorruptible arm. It's a fascinating story. And it was interesting because Bishop Joseph Adamak, who had come all that way to serve a mass, a special mass, on the anniversary of that battle, that fight where all of this occurred, he actually said he saw him standing there watching. That's not something you would get a Catholic priest to admit very often. But it's a fascinating story of an incorruptible skeletal arm, of an arm that was not corrupted as well the rest of him was. And I thought it was a fascinating story. I wanted to tuck it in there. Now, I wanted to very quickly touch on a few things. So we've stuck with European mostly, but in Japan, they have, and I'm hoping I say this right, the Gasha do Koro, who are a group of skeletal warriors, men who died in battle and were never buried properly, who are 5 times the size of what they were as human beings. And these skeletons are seen and as they haunt areas where they had died. These legends and myths go all the way back to the 10th century. The idea of it has been picked up by cartoons and anime and all this other stuff, but the actual stories behind it date all the way back to the 10th century. So there are other cultures that encounter such beings as well. Now, I had said at the beginning we might talk for a couple seconds about what could this possibly mean. So there are some theories as to why the skeletal beings appear, or the screaming skulls, and that's that these are souls that were not allowed to cross over for some reason, and they're trying to communicate to the living. Some people believe that these are demonic entities that are using this guise for a way to suck negative energy out of these people by the fear. You know, we produce a form of energy with fear that perhaps they eat, that they might be lower shadow spirits or elementals, as you had said. There was an interesting one, though, that I came across was that spirits can choose any form they want to have, that some of them are beautiful, at other times they become ugly or frightening, that a skeleton might appear, a ghost might appear as a skeleton, a fairy, or a departed loved one, that the spirits can cause or relieve pain, and that sometimes people who are afflicted suddenly with serious illnesses should be looking to see if there's anything of that nature that has appeared to them in their lifetime, bringing with it the negative energy. I thought it was a fascinating idea, but there's one last one, that skeletons in certain areas, arenas of life, like in tarot cards, portray death. But they don't just portray death, they also state change, the end of something, the beginning of something new. Something dies, something comes up. So there are some people who see this type of symbolism in it, stating that they're letting you know something's going to change, something's going to be given up, or something new is coming into your life. So there are lots of different reasons why people believe this. The last one I found really interesting. So there was a person who was reading all those threads and came up with this information. He said that reading the stories about the skeletons that appeared and what have you reminded him of a story he had heard from a family friend who was a psychic and who had tried to do yoga. But when she did yoga, she, after several lessons, she got frightened and decided to not try it, to do anything in the paranormal field at all anymore, because of what happened to her. So she had been trying to do out-of-body experiences, and I'm not going to go into what that means, except that your body and your soul separate for a small period of time and then should come back together appropriately. So she managed to get this to happen, and she said she saw her body floating at a great speed, and she shot upward, and as if she was leaving the earth. And while she was doing this, she could see herself, and her hair, her skin, her everything fell off of her body, and just her skeleton was laying there on the ground. And it scared her so badly that she was afraid, and she dashed back into her body. And she said that what she took from this is that we are one with the universe, and that when you try to separate, you kind of cause a schism, if you will. And it frightened her so much that she never wanted to deal with anything in the paranormal world ever again.
Yeah, again, all kinds of thoughts. I don't know which ones I want to share, because I had one out-of-body experience.
Okay.
And I told Mrs. Stu about it. At one time, and it happened while I was sleeping. And I forget what happened. I mean, how could you dream something that, well, anyway, if this was a dream, it was the most extraordinary dream I've ever had, because in the dream, I was laying in a bed. So in the dream, I was in bed, and I felt myself leave my body. And it was the most pleasant, extraordinary feeling I've ever had. And it was just so tranquil and peaceful. And I'm looking at myself, just like people say they look at themselves. And then next thing I know, I'm back in my body and I'm actually awake. And so Mrs. Stu said, is that at a time, because there was a time when I used a CPAP machine because I had sleep apnea, and I no longer do. And she said, maybe that was a time before you had, you still had sleep apnea, but before you were diagnosed and you actually did die. So that was her theory of what may have happened. But again, but I saw myself, and just the feeling was just so incredible. I'd never felt anything like that before. So they say when you have a dream, I mean, you really only, you can only create a dream out of things that you've experienced, people that you've seen. Like you shouldn't see a stranger in a dream. Except, well, you're the exception to that one. But
I've met strangers in my dreams. Yeah.
Yeah. So so I'd never had anything like that happen to me before. So it was it a dream? Yeah, maybe. but I certainly don't think it was, you know.
Yeah.
Hmm. But I had all my flesh on me. You know, there was
Well, I'm
no.
glad to hear that. I mean, I think like I one day we'll sit down and do some near death experiences, and people have had, like, you hear that traditional story of how, you know, you come up out of your body, it's so amazing, you feel no fear whatsoever, you go through the tunnel of light and you feel great warmth and peace and love. And that is what most people talk about when they come back, and they'll say things like, I'm not afraid to die, I don't want to die, but I'm not afraid of death anymore. And that's the norm. That's what you normally hear. That's what has been made famous. But there are a whole other set of stories. So maybe like your story was very pleasant, hers was very unpleasant, and it may have something to do with some other thing going on. Maybe yours was so pleasant because you were a good person and you were at peace. Maybe she was struggling and not at peace with who she was and what was going on in her world, and it manifested in that frightening way. So honest to God, I don't know the answer to everything. I mean, like, being the paranormalist doesn't mean I know everything. I just have a lot of questions and I've
Mhm.
spent a lot of years looking at it. So I don't have all the answers to everything. Those are things that we're probably not going to find out till we pass on to the other side ourselves, and maybe not even all of it then. Um, but I ask the questions and I share the stories and I say, what if? And it's up to the listener and those watching to decide what they want to take from it. But if you're one of those people who've had one of those experiences and you've never shared it with anybody and you're not sure what to make of it, I just want you to know there are other people out there who have also had those experiences. One of the things I took away from all those threads I read was that so many people were relieved to find out they were not singular in that experience, that others had shared similar experiences. And they wanted to affirm those other people and say, I believe you because blah, blah, blah happened to me. And I never told anybody, because when I tried to tell somebody, they all told me it was a nightmare or I made it up or whatever. And I thought it was just me all these years. Oh, thank God there's other people like me out there. So just know you're not alone.
Well, I hate to say this, people seek validation.
Sure.
That's why there are like buttons.
Sure.
Yeah. Just like on this video. Click the like button, please.
Oh, very
Like
good.
the content. Yeah.
But if people want to reach out to us, they have lots of ways to do that, don't they?
They do. And do you have more stories? I don't want to cut you off.
No, we have
Okay.
come to the end of this
So
journey tonight.
yeah, the many ways for them to contact us. Let's go in reverse order this time. Let's go to the email address, paranormalist at theparanormalistpodcast.com. Link will be in the description. Um, please send us your ideas, your stories, things that you may not have told to other people that you may want to share with us, and we will keep your information confidential, absolutely. We do have the Facebook group. Again, we're fast approaching 500 members in the Facebook group now, which is really nice. That's the Paranormalist Podcast on Facebook. And if you happen to be watching this video from Facebook, it's actually coming to you from YouTube. And our YouTube channel is the Paranormalist Podcast as well, which I think we just gained another subscriber over the weekend, which is great. Yeah, so please, if you like our content, click the like button, click the subscribe button and the bell, and click all notifications, and you'll get a little notification up there in the corner of YouTube whenever we release new content, which is semi-regular at best. So
It's usually almost always once a week, maybe once in a while, not so, because there's something going on.
Exactly. We try to do it once a week, but if and it usually takes me about a week to edit and get it published. And so I apologize, but life intervenes. Yeah.
It does. And there's a few times when we've missed because there's family events going on and things of that nature. And I refuse to allow the dead, and I know that you probably feel the same way, to overtake what we should be doing with those who are living and loving us today. So for special holidays and events and things like that, you know, if I have to make a choice, and Stu, you can speak for yourself, but I'm pretty sure you feel the same way. If I have to make a choice between like spending a special holiday with my grandchildren and my children, I'll do that, and we'll catch up later.
Agreed.
Yep. And I hope that everybody else does the same thing too. You know, don't worry, we'll be back. We're not going very far. It's just sometimes the world intervenes and our families have to come first.
But that I want to make it, that's going to probably be the exception and not the
It
rule.
is
For the
indeed.
most part, I mean, we mostly weekly. I mean, we started doing this November of last year. Was that when it was?
I know it's kind of coming up on a year here, not too far in the future.
I think we did that, and now this episode will be episode number 23 of the reincarnation of the show. So, and I'm not counting. There was a ghost stories that was 1.1.
Mm-hmm.
So episode 2.1.1.
It was our practice one, I think.
Mm-hmm. Well, there were good stories in there, so why not? Let's share.
I have been blessed with a lot of good stories, and I'm so lucky to get to share them with everybody. And for each and every person who listens, whether you've subscribed or you haven't, thank you very much. And those who joined our group, as you said, we're getting close to 500. We appreciate each and every one of you. Now I just want to get everybody talking and sharing, because it's so much more fun when we're all talking together. But thank all of you for your time. You'll never know how grateful we are.
Well said. So with that, my dear, I'll bid you good evening.
And the same to you, Stu. Good night.